Good morning, students. Happy Monday. Welcome back to another Questions from Quarantine. I don't know if you guys have seen the weather outside today, but it is absolutely nuts. It seems like it is raining crazy hard for like 20 minutes, and then out of nowhere the sun will come out, and then next thing you know it's raining again. So we're just having a crazy day here in Annapolis, Maryland. But it certainly is peaceful and nice to kind of have the rain. I don't think we had rain. Actually, we've had rain recently. Regardless, it is awesome to have the peaceful weather, in my opinion, especially since we can't really be going outside anyways. But we're back with another Questions from Quarantine, a difficult topic today. I'll be honest and straightforward about that one. We are not going to dive crazy extensively into this question because it is a thick question that would take a long time to unpack, and even the greatest minds struggle to unpack this question. So certainly myself, I do not feel qualified to give an extensive response to this, but I hope I want to give a response that is sufficient enough to encourage us today and remind us that God is in control, that He's reigning supreme, especially as we walk through kind of this stage in life right now, and also as we kind of look forward to what the future might hold too. And so the question is this: can we expect the world to end in a similar way as to that of which the Bible describes it? With things like fires, earthquakes, plagues, all that suffering going on. Can we expect the world to end in a similar way? And so the two books that primarily talk about the end times are probably Daniel and Revelation. And what's interesting about both Daniel and Revelation is they are apocalyptic literature, meaning that there's a lot of symbolic things happening in them that can be difficult to interpret, whether that's meant to be symbolically or literally. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and why that's an important distinction to make and how that might shift or help us to understand better how to view this topic and this question. Now there are 5 things that I wanted to touch on today in this video that will kind of progressively walk through the points that I want to emphasize and the direction that I want to take you as we think through this question and our understanding and interpretation of what the end times might look like. And so the first one that I already touched on a little bit earlier, that I touched on right at the beginning of the video, is that I am not in a position where I have done extensive research to be able to sufficiently answer this question in its entirety. I was watching an interview earlier today with 4 biblical scholars who have all unique positions on this issue and have done years upon years upon years of research into eschatology. Eschatology is essentially the study of end times, the study of end things. And so these guys have done extensive research on this topic, and yet they felt woefully insufficient in being able to answer it. And in fact, all 4 of them had differing perspectives on kind of where they landed on the book of Revelation and how to interpret it. I liked what one of the panelists said. His name is John Piper. He's a fantastic pastor. And he has great resources. And John Piper made the point to emphasize that it's been 2,000 years since we've had these writings, and even in the course of that time, we've not reached a point where we've been able to understand and interpret what is being talked about here. So if 2,000 years we can't do it, then I certainly am unable to do it in the course of a week. So having talked about the fact that there are different viewpoints in the book of Revelation, I want to talk about 2 of the different topics that have differing viewpoints in the book of Revelation. One of that being in relation to the tribulation, and secondly being in relation to the millennium, or the 1,000-year reign. So as it relates to the tribulation, we have 2 different views, and that is pre-tribulation and post-tribulation. Now these 2 are pretty straightforward. Pre-tribulation, people believe that Christians are raptured prior to the tribulation, hence pre-tribulation. Whereas post-tribulation, people believe that Christians are raptured after the tribulation. Now the other topic that's typically talked about is the millennial period, so the 1,000-year reign. And there's 3 different viewpoints on this one. There's amillennialism, there's postmillennialism, and there's premillennialism. Premillennialism believes that Christ will return prior to the 1,000-year reign on earth, and Christ will reign on earth during that 1,000-year time. So that's the belief that the devil has been locked up during that time. There will be no sin, no pain, no hurt on the earth during that time. It's free from sin, and that 1,000-year reign, Jesus reigns on earth. So premillennialism believes that Christ comes before the millennial reign. Postmillennialism believes that Christ comes after the 1,000-year reign. So right, there's the 1,000-year reign here on earth, and then Christ comes at the end of that time. But what's unique about postmillennialism as it relates to premillennialism is that there is still that 1,000-year reign where the devil is still locked up. There's no sin reigning on earth. In fact, everyone who's on earth in that time will come to know Jesus. All right, so that's the belief of postmillennialism. That there's still the 1,000-year reign, but that Christ doesn't come until after the reign occurs. And then amillennialism is the belief that Christ comes after the 1,000-year reign. But what's different about amillennialism as it relates to postmillennialism and premillennialism is that amillennialism does not believe that there is a distinct 1,000-year reign where the devil is locked up. All right, so amillennialism believes that we are currently in that 1,000-year reign, that we are in that time period where all of that is occurring. But regardless of when Christ comes, it's not like prior to that time there was 1,000 years of reigning on earth, or after that time there's 1,000 years of reigning on earth. So premillennialism and postmillennialism believe that there will be a future 1,000-year reign of heaven on earth. Amillennialism, on the other hand, believes that we are already in that time and there will not be a future reign without sin. Now, I would also encourage you guys to look at those views on your own. That is my interpretation and understanding of them. I certainly have more learning to do as it relates to both of those topics, right? The tribulation and the millennial reign. But from what I've studied and understood, that's kind of the best way that I can think through it and explain it to you all. Now, why is that important? Well, I think that's important because it helps us to understand that the reality of interpreting the book of Revelation is not as straightforward as just saying, yes, this will happen in the future, or no, this will not happen in the future. When posed with the question, what will the future look like? How will the world end? In a lot of ways, I'm just not entirely sure. In a lot of ways, it also just depends on your understanding of the scriptures, where you stand as a pre-trib or post-trib, and amillennialist or premillennialist or postmillennialist. Wherever you land or fall in those categories based on how you understand and interpret the Bible, I think ultimately dictates your understanding of how the world will end. And so it's just important to kind of talk through those things up front and to begin with. And again, go back to the reality of talking about what we're looking at in here in the book of Revelation is not as straightforward and black and white. It's just saying this is what will happen, this is when it will happen, and this is how it will happen. Right? It's a little bit more difficult than that. But having said that, the third thing that I want to touch on is the reality of Revelation being either a symbolic book or a serious book, right? We kind of fight that battle with trying to understand what is being spoken of here. As I mentioned earlier, Revelation is an apocalyptic literary style, which means a lot of it is meant to be interpreted symbolically. However, and I want to emphasize this, however, though it's meant to be interpreted symbolically, the reason that it's meant to be interpreted symbolically is to point to the seriousness of what we're talking about, of what we're discussing. And so though we wouldn't necessarily expect everything in the book of Revelation to play out as it's spoken of or talked about in the book of Revelation, we certainly recognize that there's a seriousness to it. And the reason that John spoke in this way, that he used this symbolism, that he spoke about these things happening or occurring, is because in a lot of ways they're going to be very similar to what he is ultimately describing. The suffering, the sin, the plagues, the destruction that is going to occur in the future, though it won't necessarily always be exactly as he laid it out, it'll be very similar to how he laid it out. And so it's important to recognize that. Now, I think John was very wise in how he wrote the book of Revelation and how it ultimately was written. Obviously, he was inspired by the Holy Spirit while doing this, so it wasn't based entirely on himself. These are God's words spoken through John, so we can rest in that. But I think the way that the book is laid out is unique and helpful in our understanding of how we can interpret this in our day and age. Right, so chapters 6 through 20, those are the chapters that typically touch on the most suffering, pain, persecution, the plagues, the bowls, all that stuff being handed down on earth. But prior to chapter 6, we have chapter 5. And in chapter 5, John speaks about the Lamb. He speaks about Jesus, who's able to open up the scroll. So I want to read Revelation chapter 5 really quick for you to help you understand kind of the piece that we can find before we jump into chapter 6. It says this: Then I saw on the right hand of him who is seated on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God, from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." And so I just thought that was a really, really, really good reminder for us as we head into these chapters of Revelation 6 through 20, which we're obviously not going to look at today because that would take forever. But as we head into those chapters of 6 through 20, where it's talking about a lot of suffering, tribulation, and trials, we see the reminder that Jesus' death, the fact that he was slain, what we celebrated just yesterday with Easter, right? His resurrection from the dead. Jesus' life was ultimately a ransom to bring back his people towards us. Towards him, I mean. Right, in verses 9 and 10, it says, "For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." So as long as we place our faith in Jesus, we know that we have been ransomed to God. And this reminder is given to us prior to all the events that happened in chapters 6 through 20. So regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of how you believe that the world will end or the timing of how these things will go down, there's that helpful reminder that says, once we place our faith in Jesus, Jesus ransomed us back to God forever. There's no separation from him. And so all that being said brings us to point number 5, and that is, what can we expect as we think about this stuff from the book of Revelation, right? As we think about the questions like, how is the world going to end? Is it going to end like it talks about here in Revelation? There's 3 things that I want us to focus on and think through when we kind of think about our expectations for all this. Number 1 being that we can expect that suffering and evil and pain will continue to occur in the world until Christ returns. In fact, as Christians, I think we can expect that that is going to increase and grow. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to increase to a level into which we cannot bear it, because we are promised in the Bible that God is not going to give us anything that we cannot bear. We're promised in the Bible that he will not abandon us. We're promised in the Bible that he will remain steadfast in his love towards us. But until Christ returns, we know that that stuff is going to occur. Right? Even right now, as we kind of are in the midst of this pandemic with the coronavirus, we know that ultimately that God is in control, that he is reigning supreme, that he is Lord over the entire earth, and he sees us right now. He sees all those who are suffering, and they're not outside of his understanding, outside of his influence. And so, though those things will continue, we know that they will only continue until Christ returns. And that brings us to point number 2, right? And that is that Jesus will indeed return at a time in the future, but at a time that only God the Father knows. Right? Matthew 24:36 says this, "But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." All right, so when we talk about Jesus coming back, it's really interesting to think that God the Father has a specific time when he wants him to return, but even Jesus doesn't know that time specifically. Not even the angels, right? No one knows that time except for God the Father. And so as we read the book of Revelation, we have to be very, very careful to not sit here and look at all these events happening and say that we can pinpoint a specific time when God the Father is going to send back Jesus. Because the Bible is clear that only God knows that time. And in other places throughout the Bible, it speaks about how we need to prepare ourselves for that time, to be ready, to not be asleep, to not be expecting that we can figure out when that time will occur, to not be lazy as it relates to that time, but instead every single day preparing ourselves for that time to come as if it were about to happen that next hour. So we need to be thinking about it that way. And then final thing, point number 3, is that once we've placed our faith in Jesus, we know for certain that God will not abandon us or let us go. So regardless of the things that we're going to face in the future, the tribulations or the sufferings that we may go through or experience, the things that happen around us in the world, we can rest in knowing that God made a promise that He will not abandon us so long as we've placed our faith in Jesus Christ. I was reading in John 6, when was this? Maybe a day or two ago. I thought this verse was really powerful. It's John 6:37. It says, "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out." And that's Jesus speaking there. So Jesus says, anyone that the Father sends to me, who believes in me, who places their faith in me, I will never cast them out. They will always remain tied to me. That's right in the middle of Him talking about Himself being the bread of life. And Jesus saying that only those who come to me and believe in me as the bread can have their fill, can be sustained. So that's a really good kind of reminder for us to close on, is that regardless of what happens in the future, regardless of what Revelation 6-20 talks about and the end times and understanding of it, we can know that once we place our faith in Jesus, He will never abandon us nor leave us. And even more importantly, He will always kind of give us enough to get through those times. They will be difficult, they will be hard, but He certainly won't let us fight it alone. He's right there fighting us beside it. So that's all I got to say. Hopefully this was an informative message for you guys to think through. Again, not extensive in the slightest. I understand that. I recognize that. That was not the purpose of it all. I wanted to kind of just take the time to touch on the topic, walk through it very briefly, and give you guys a few points of encouragement. As always, I'm always available for questions. If you have any further questions, certainly ask away. I'd love to answer them. And if you have questions related to this as well, please let me know. And though I might not have an answer on the spot, I'm certainly willing to kind of take the time, sit down with you, read through it, talk through it, think through it, to hopefully get to a place where we can find an answer. All right, enjoy the rest of your day. Happy Monday. Bye.